I didn't see it coming, not like this. They waited until Friday, of course. They always wait until Friday. Something about letting bad news bleed into the weekend so you'll have time to process before raising hell. But this wasn't just bad news. This was a goddamn funeral. The meeting was called for 3 p.m. Touch base before the weekend, they said in the email. No subject line, no hint of what was about to unfold. But I felt it. The same way a man feels rain in his bones before it hits the roof. I wore a tie. Not because I needed to, but because I had a feeling. I always hated that sterile conference room with its brushed chrome fixtures and wall-mounted screen nobody ever used. The walls were too white, the kind of white that makes you feel like you're waiting to be judged, not heard. When I walked in, all 4 of them were already seated. That was my first clue. Raymond, Carter, Denise, and fucking Brian, of course Brian was there. The prodigy. My so-called successor. The bastard was sitting in my chair. There was no coffee, no idle chatter, not even a half-hearted "How was your week, Ed?" Just Denise looking up with that tight-lipped HR smile and saying, "Edward, please, have a seat." I didn't sit. "You can say it while I stand," I replied. My voice came out steady, too steady. The kind of calm that only shows up when everything inside you is starting to fracture. Raymond, the oldest of the partners after me, cleared his throat. "It's time, Ed." "Time for what?" Brian looked down like he couldn't bear to watch a dog get put down. Denise took over. "We've all been discussing the future of the firm." "You mean the firm I co-founded?" I interrupted. She didn't flinch. "Yes, the one you helped build. And we're grateful. But the landscape is shifting, and we need fresh eyes. New energy. Your projects haven't aligned with the firm's direction in some time now." I turned to Carter. He wouldn't meet my gaze. I knew what that meant. They'd already moved my nameplate. I looked down at the folder Denise had placed in front of her. The severance package. 5 pages. Neat. Clean. Sterile as hell. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach across the table and slap Brian out of that chair. But I didn't. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the pen I've used on every blueprint for the last 30 years, Mont Blanc, silver clip, black lacquer, and laid it carefully on the table. "You're giving my office to him," I said, nodding toward Brian. He finally looked up. "It's not personal, Edward," Raymond said. But it was. Of course it was. Brian finally spoke. "Your work, it's beautiful, but it's dated. The city wants mixed-use towers, glass-forward design. Your sketches still have hand shading. And those sketches," I said slowly, "have been on the cover of Architect Digest more times than your name's even been printed." Brian flushed. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "You think a man's work stops being relevant because you can't fit it on a phone screen?" Denise pushed the folder forward. "The decision is final. We'd appreciate your discretion during the transition. There's a very generous retirement bonus." That word, retirement, tasted like ash. I picked up the pen, slid it back into my pocket, and buttoned my coat. "I built this firm," I said. "Every brick of it. Every damn client you still have on the books came through my door first. And now you want me to go out the back like I'm some intern who got caught stealing printer paper. No one's asking you to." "I'm not done." They fell silent. I looked at Brian again. He looked nervous now, unsure if this was how victory was supposed to feel. "You can have the office. Hell, take the title too," I said. "But you'll never have the city. You don't know how to speak its language. You build for drones and influencers. I built for the soul." I turned and walked out before they could say another word. My steps were slow. Deliberate. Like I was walking out of a courtroom, not a firm. The bullpen outside was quiet. Too quiet. Word had spread. Assistants looked away. One of the junior architects, a sharp girl named Harper, gave me the smallest nod. Like a soldier saluting a general who just lost the war. I made it to the elevator without breaking. Only when the doors slid shut and the city disappeared behind the frosted glass did I feel the weight in my chest. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was hollow. Like someone had carved something out of me and didn't bother to fill it back in. By the time I stepped out onto the street, the September wind cut through my coat like a blade. I walked with no real destination. Just movement. Past the buildings I helped design, cast in glass and steel, each one with a story. Each one with my name etched somewhere beneath the surface. They thought they were ending me. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. I sat at my drafting table long after the light had faded from the windows. The apartment was quiet, save for the slow tick of the wall clock and the occasional groan of the radiator. I hadn't turned on the lights. Didn't need them. The city beyond the glass offered enough illumination, just enough to cast long shadows over the blank sheets in front of me. The tools were where I'd left them. My compass. My triangle. My weighted mechanical pencil. There was a comfort in that order. I hadn't drawn anything since last spring. Not seriously. Not since the zoning board shelved my proposal for the East Bank renewal project. That had been my last commission, and my last passion. They called it too ambitious. I called it a future worth building. I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the old blueprint roll, the one with Lang redevelopment plan, Clearview sector inked in my handwriting across the label. My swan song. The one project I'd been quietly shaping for over a decade. Not for fame. Not even for money. But for legacy. Unspooling the sheet across the table, I let my fingers trace the lines I'd etched by hand, each avenue, each pedestrian path, each park and tower and plaza. It wasn't just a design. It was a philosophy. A reclamation of urban space for people, not just profits. A city within a city. I had poured everything into it. And now it sat here, gathering dust, while my so-called partners were in that conference room plotting how to carve it up. They didn't just want to steal my chair, they wanted to steal my vision. My instincts told me they were already circling the project, probably flipping through my old files the moment I walked out. Hell, they'd probably even take credit for it, pass it off as a concept revived by Brian. But if they thought they were stealing that version of the project, they were fools. Because the version they'd seen, the one I'd left behind on purpose a year ago, was outdated. Incomplete. Sanitized. The real version. That was still here, in my possession. And now, as I studied the blueprints under the city's glow, I realized something had shifted. I no longer wanted to build this city. I wanted to weaponize it. Revenge, when it's honest, doesn't come like a flame. It comes like a draft in the bones. Slow. Cold. It settles in before you even notice. And once it's there, you start seeing the world differently. My eyes scanned the skyline out the window. Some of those buildings had been mine, at least in the beginning. But over the years, corners were cut. Consultants were brought in. Inspectors paid off. I'd ignored it for too long. Maybe out of naivety. Maybe out of fear. But now I had nothing left to protect. No chair. No reputation. No office. Just this design and a truth I could no longer ignore: this firm had rotted from the inside out. I rolled out fresh paper. Clean. Untouched. And I began to draw, not as a visionary, but as an engineer of collapse. The new blueprint looked almost identical at first. Towers and green space. Transit lines. Walkable boulevards. A city planner would call it sustainable. But in the margins, I started weaving in elements no one but me would understand. Annotations that looked like material specs, but were actually financial figures. Load-bearing notes that, on second glance, doubled as ledger codes. Every structural element began to serve dual purposes, architectural and symbolic. Columns designed with measurements that aligned to bank account digits I once flagged but buried. Elevation notes that corresponded to fiscal quarters where costs had mysteriously ballooned. A shadow map that, when read properly, formed the outline of a holding company Carter once used to shuffle embezzled funds. It was art. It was confession. It was a time bomb. And the beauty was, only I knew the detonation sequence. Hours slipped by. I drew deeper. Deeper still. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth overlay, I started weaving in names. Not written plainly, of course, but encoded into the grid itself. Building names formed acronyms. Parcel numbers matched zip codes of shell companies. Every inch of this design began to breathe with purpose. By dawn, I had 3 separate layers of the blueprint complete. Each could be peeled away to reveal another version of the truth. A developer might think it's just an intricate plan. A city inspector might think it's sloppy note-keeping. But someone looking closely, someone with enough context, they'd see it. And once they did, they'd start pulling threads. I stood from the table and stretched. My back popped, my knees ached, but for the first time in months, my mind was sharp. Focused. Electric. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it slowly, watching the city blink awake through my window. Somewhere in that skyline, Denise was likely preparing her press release. Carter was reviewing budgets. Raymond was probably reading the Times on his back porch, thinking he'd retired the old wolf with grace. And Brian? Brian was probably sitting in my office chair, feet kicked up, dreaming of his first solo project. I smiled. Because if there's one thing architects understand better than anyone else, it's load distribution. You don't topple a structure by attacking the roof. You pull from the foundation. And I had just redrawn the entire foundation. There's a moment when every man who's been betrayed realizes he holds more secrets than those who betrayed him. That moment came to me 2 nights after I redrew the design, somewhere between insomnia and rage. The old file boxes had been sitting in the back closet for years. I'd told myself I was saving them in case the city needed records. That was a lie. I kept them because I never trusted the people I worked beside. It started innocently. A receipt here, a discrepancy there. Most of us learned to look the other way when numbers didn't quite add up. Construction is a dirty business. You fight for a contract, underbid to win it, then bleed the budget dry with change orders and cost adjustments. It's how the game is played. But at some point, they stopped playing by the rules entirely. I knew the patterns. Raymond liked to funnel funds through consultants. Carter worked closely with city inspectors who never seemed to notice when load specs didn't meet code. Denise, always meticulous, always cold, handled the payouts through a web of shell companies tied to third-party contractors we didn't manage directly. And Brian? The golden boy didn't even need to hide. He just inherited the machine already running at full steam, too arrogant to realize he was sitting atop a house of cards built on laundered invoices and greased palms. I opened the first box at 1:47 a.m. Inside were old bid packages from a riverfront renovation we did in 2015. I remember the project vividly because the costs ballooned by nearly 40% midway through, and somehow, nobody asked questions. I found the original estimate, clipped to a revised version marked, Final, Approved. 2 separate contractors listed for the same portion of work. Same address. Slightly different company names. That was the first thread. I started pulling. Invoices matched payment dates, but not vendor codes. The same lumber marked, delivered, to 2 sites on the same day. The digital records didn't match the hard copies. I compared signatures. Carter's scribbled approval looked like it had been scanned and pasted. This was no accident. This was an operation. By 3 a.m., I had a stack of documents nearly a foot high, each one more damning than the last. I wasn't just looking at corner cutting. I was staring at tax fraud, false reporting, falsified safety inspections, and what looked like a legitimate bribery trail wrapped up in foundation costs. But here's the part that made my fingers itch with the urge to draw again. All of it could be hidden in plain sight. Inside design. You see, architecture isn't just about walls and windows. It's about systems. Layouts. Layers. Just like corruption. And I realized then, I didn't need to leak these documents or turn them in. I could bury them into the blueprint. It would be my magnum opus. A confession posing as a masterpiece. And they wouldn't even see it coming, until it was far too late. I scanned each document carefully, cropping out identifying names, leaving just enough breadcrumb detail to suggest a connection. I embedded QR codes behind column annotations. I built shadowy overlays that appeared innocuous unless read at the exact print scale. My favorite? I took a ledger listing questionable payouts and used the payment amounts to define the radius of landscape features in the park design. A sculpture path in the shape of a dollar sign, with benches placed at exact coordinates matching offshore account dates. I wasn't just exposing them. I was designing their undoing. At dawn, I stepped outside for air. The city was just waking up, and the streets were washed in that bruised purple light that only appears before sunrise. I watched a street cleaner roll by, its bristles hissing against the curb, and thought, nobody ever notices the cleanup crew. That's what I was now. The last man standing with broom in hand, sweeping up after years of excess. I went back inside and opened my email for the first time in days. A ping from Denise, subject line, Intellectual Property Review, Lang Files. They were digging. Probably trying to figure out what I'd left behind. There was a line in her message that made me chuckle. We want to ensure the firm is respecting your contributions during this transition. Translation, we're getting your work, but we're going to slap your name on the trash can lid. I didn't respond. Instead, I attached a stripped-down version of my updated blueprints, just enough to intrigue, but not enough to incriminate. I labeled it Early Concept, Draft 4. 3. And then I did something petty. But satisfying. I printed a copy of a 2016 invoice, one I knew was fake, with Carter's signature and a delivery address that didn't exist, and folded it into an origami crane. I placed it beside the model on my shelf, a silent monument to how deeply they'd underestimated me. I spent the next 2 days going through every old folder, every digital backup. My process was slow, deliberate. I redrafted portions of the plan using methods no intern today would understand: manual scale conversion, coded hatch patterns, cross-reference matrix annotations. To anyone else, it looked like overkill. But to someone trained, someone who understood how design speaks beneath the surface, it was damning. I started storing copies of everything in 2 places, one physical, locked in a safety deposit box under my wife's maiden name, and one digital, uploaded to an encrypted cloud archive labeled simply, Swan. And that's when I remembered something. Something I had forgotten for nearly a decade. Back in 2012, I'd attended a city procurement hearing where Raymond had casually name-dropped a local official, Harper Young, as a friendly vote. It was strange at the time. I'd written it off as him puffing up. But 2 weeks later, our firm won a bid despite being 12% over the lowest competitor. I pulled the bid report. Sure enough, the margin was off. The evaluation sheet had been altered. It wasn't just construction fraud. It was public contract tampering. My pulse quickened. If I was right, and I was damn sure I was right, they hadn't just broken ethical codes. They had committed felonies. Felonies documented, signed, and stored in boxes nobody had bothered to clean out. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But this wasn't cold. It was methodical. And with every page I scanned, with every stroke of graphite I laid onto tracing paper, I wasn't just designing a building anymore. I was designing a goddamn reckoning. It took me 3 days to get the smell of the old firm out of my coat. 3 days, and it was still there, faint, but unmistakable. That sterile mix of synthetic carpet, overbrewed coffee, and ambition. You never really notice it when you work there, not until you leave. Then it lingers, like smoke in your clothes after a fire you barely escaped. I hadn't planned to go back. Not yet. But the idea came to me while eating breakfast, staring at my toast without tasting it. You can't catch rats by chasing them. You catch them by giving them something to chew. I shaved, put on the same suit I wore to that Friday execution, and combed my hair so carefully you'd think I had somewhere dignified to be. I even wore a tie, the burgundy one my wife used to say made me look like I still had power. It was all part of the script. The frail lion returning to the watering hole. Let them think I was licking old wounds. I walked into the lobby of Lang and Partners like I had forgotten I was no longer welcome. The receptionist, new, young, someone I didn't recognize, gave me a wary smile. "Mr. Lang," she said, half standing. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. But Brian asked me to drop something off. Just a few things I forgot to hand over." She hesitated. "I'll let him know." "No need," I said gently, lifting the folder in my hand. "I'll just be a minute. He's seen me in worse moods." It was a bluff, but people rarely argue with confidence. She sat back down. I walked through the glass security doors, past the bullpen, past the junior architects trying to look busy. Most avoided eye contact, but one or two shot me quick glances. I saw Harper again, the young architect with a sharp eye. She looked up from her screen and gave me that same tight nod. I nodded back. Brian's office, my old office, was ahead. I paused just outside, adjusted my tie in the glass reflection, and stepped in without knocking. He looked up from his laptop, startled. "Edward?" "Brian," I said, with the most genuine smile I could fake. "Brought some drafts I thought might be useful." He stood quickly, trying to disguise how flustered he was. "You didn't need to." "I know," I said, holding up the folder. "But I hate leaving things unfinished. These are from the Clearview project. Some early revisions I'd never digitized." He reached for the folder, but I didn't hand it over just yet. "Of course," I added, "they're rough. Nothing final. But you might find some ideas in there. Thought I'd leave them in good hands." He took the folder, flipping it open. I could see his eyes scanning the first few pages, the lines crisp, the layout more advanced than anything I'd left in the system. His mouth twitched. "These look modern." I chuckled. "Maybe I've still got a little juice left. Don't worry, call it a gift." That did it. His posture shifted. Less defensive, more relaxed. He thought he'd won again. That I was giving up scraps from the past like a defeated master to a triumphant student. "I appreciate this," he said, already sliding the folder onto his desk, like it was his now. I turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Oh, and Brian?" I said without looking back. "Yeah. Be careful with the utilities placement around the South Transit hub. The city's been jumpy about zoning violations ever since that lawsuit last year." He blinked, unsure if I was warning him or testing him. I walked away before he could answer. As I passed the open plan desks, I saw Harper again. She was still watching me. I gave her a subtle smile, not warm, not cold. Just enough to let her know something had shifted. She tilted her head, curious. Let them be curious. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was already picturing their next move. Brian would share the designs in a partner meeting. He'd downplay my involvement. "Ed left these lying around," he'd say. "Nothing finished, but there's something we could polish." They'd see the brilliance, of course. That was the hook. The project was undeniable, streamlined, future-forward, sustainable. The kind of blueprint that wins over councils and zoning boards. The kind that headlines architecture blogs and gets shared by city influencers. And beneath it, hidden like bones under a cathedral, the truth waited. I spent the evening preparing the next phase. I set a Google alert on the firm's name and the Clearview redevelopment tag. I knew they'd rush to secure presentation rights. Probably slap Brian's name on the pitch and frame it as a collaborative handoff. I didn't mind. The more credit they took, the deeper the stake. Because what they didn't know was that embedded in those drafts were markers, my own form of creative surveillance. I'd encoded them with metadata tied to a unique encryption string. If they uploaded the files to any public server, I'd know within the hour. And more importantly, so would others, inspectors, regulators, watchdogs. I'd made sure of that. Not yet. But soon. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window overlooking the skyline. The city twinkled like it was proud of its lies. I watched for a long time, remembering the first building I ever designed, the Lang Medical Pavilion. It still stood 3 blocks east, its atrium catching the amber streetlight. I remembered laying out those blueprints on my kitchen table, terrified I'd screw it up. Now, years later, I wasn't scared of mistakes. I was counting on them. Let Brian and the others pick up that folder like it was discarded genius. Let them run with it. Because what they didn't know was that I had just handed them a loaded gun. And I was the only one who knew which way it pointed. The first article hit the local design blog 2 weeks later. Lang and Partners unveils bold vision for Clearview sector redevelopment. I read the headline while sipping black coffee, the kind that turns bitter before it even cools. They'd done exactly what I expected. Pulled my design out of the folder, buffed it with jargon, slapped a new title on it, and pitched it as the firm's next flagship project. Only they didn't call it my design. No. The byline under the renderings read: Lead Architect, Brian Kellerman. He stood in front of a stylized mock-up, all smiles and flawless stubble, dressed like he'd just come from a rooftop bar and not the foundation of a billion-dollar pitch. His quote, "This is the future of urban living, sustainable, connected, and inspired by the city's heritage." Inspired by me, you mean? I leaned back in my chair and let the anger come, but only for a moment. It passed, replaced by something quieter. Satisfaction, maybe. Or the calm before a storm. The next day, the public hearing was announced. City Council Chambers. Thursday. Open to developers, press, and interested citizens. I circled the date in red ink and underlined it twice. They wanted a stage. I'd give them one. The council chamber had changed over the years. Brighter lighting. Cleaner lines. Sleek panels and discreet cameras along the walls. But it still smelled the same: stale air, warm electronics, old carpet fibers. The kind of room where policy is drafted while coffee cools in paper cups. I arrived early and sat in the back. Nobody noticed me. They were too busy setting up. Brian stood near the dais, adjusting a digital projector. Carter and Raymond were reviewing a thick presentation binder. Denise hovered near a PR rep, whispering in tight tones. Their suits were sharp. Expensive. All blacks and grays, like mourners at the wake of integrity. I spotted Harper a few rows up, seated with other junior staffers. She hadn't seen me. Good. The mayor's aide called the room to order. Murmurs died down as the lights dimmed. Next on the docket, Lang and Partners Clearview Sector Redevelopment Proposal. Lead architect Brian Kellerman will present. Brian stepped forward, cleared his throat, and smiled for the cameras. What followed was a flawless performance. He hit every beat like a conductor with a practiced hand. Transit integration. Green roofing. Water reclamation. Affordable housing that wasn't really affordable, but sounded like it. He moved through slides of my designs with the flair of someone born to manipulate a crowd. Every element I had agonized over was presented like a casual stroke of genius. But I wasn't listening to the pitch. I was watching the council members. At first, they nodded along, familiar, confident. But then came slide 14. A cross-section of the South Transit Hub. Councilman Ortiz leaned in. Slide 17, the load distribution matrix, where I'd embedded the first coded anomalies, subtle discrepancies between structural load and declared materials. City Planner Singh furrowed her brow. Slide 22, the landscape design, my favorite. Where bench placements formed the shape of a $sign when plotted at scale, and tree alignments matched transaction dates from a 2015 embezzlement scheme. I saw it. The moment it happened. The seed of doubt took root. One by one, they began whispering. Pointing. Passing notes. Brian kept talking, unaware his beautiful ship was already taking on water. And finally, he said, we've embedded a symbolic public art piece at the center plaza, an arch meant to represent transparency and civic unity. That arch, Councilwoman Delaney interrupted, has dimensions that don't match your scale. Can you explain the discrepancy? Brian blinked. Oh, that's just a drafting variance. Nothing structural. But the elevation notes reference a holding company address, she continued, flipping through her packet. Is that correct? A pause. Carter leaned forward. I believe that's a misprint. Actually, Singh cut in, this entire subsection seems dense with annotations. Some of them resemble fiscal codes, not structural specs. The room changed. The silence wasn't respectful now, it was suspicious. Brian tried to recover, fumbling with his clicker. These are just placeholders. We had an older architect consult briefly, an older architect? Delaney asked. Brian froze. Denise stepped in, her voice smooth. One of our retired partners left behind some conceptual drafts. We integrated the strongest ideas with our own. Councilman Ortiz raised an eyebrow. So this isn't entirely your work? Brian hesitated. Well, conceptually, yes, but... Singh held up a sheet. This crosshatch pattern in section B isn't a design element. It's a ledger grid. I know because I've seen this formatting in forensic audits. Dead silence. I didn't move. I didn't smile. But inside, I felt something ignite. A new voice piped up, one I hadn't expected. Harper. She stood. Excuse me, sorry, but I noticed some of those notations too. A few weeks ago. I thought they were typos, but now I'm not so sure. She looked straight at Brian. You said this was all yours. Brian's face collapsed into a mask of uncertainty. Harper, this isn't the time. But it was. The moment had arrived. Because now everyone in the room knew there was a second author. A ghost behind the lines. And that ghost had embedded a signature they didn't understand. Brian stammered, flipping slides, mumbling about revisions and oversight. I stood. Quietly. Deliberately. No need to shout. No need to announce myself. Every head turned. Brian saw me, and in that moment, the color left his face. Edward Lang, Architect Emeritus. The man who just took the blueprints of his own exile and turned them into a confession. I didn't speak. I just watched. And they all watched me. Not as a relic. But as a reckoning. The inspector's name was Mariel Vega. Young. Sharp. Not easily impressed. I met her only once, briefly, during a zoning board mixer back when the city still invited me to things. She was just an assistant then, quiet in a corner with a ginger ale while the senior staff drank wine and laughed too loud. But I remembered her. Because she watched the room the same way I did. Now, a week after the council presentation, she had my old blueprint spread across a long oak table in the planning department's coldest conference room. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead. A fan clicked softly in the corner. She didn't look up when Brian entered. "This will only take a moment," he said, flashing that polished grin. "We're here to clarify a few things. Just cleaning up the draft anomalies." Mariel finally raised her head. Her eyes were unreadable. "It's not just anomalies anymore, Mr. Kellerman." She tapped a section of the blueprint with the end of her pen. "These annotations don't make sense architecturally. But they correspond to documented vendor payments your firm filed in 2015, 2017, and 2019. Brian shifted. "That must be a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," she said calmly. Her assistant handed her another sheet. "These line weights here," she continued, "are inconsistently applied. But when analyzed under contrast filters, they match the signature outlines of account routing numbers tied to foreign investment groups. Ones your firm used in offshore holdings." Brian's face twitched. "Let me be clear," Mariel said, folding her hands. "We haven't accused anyone of wrongdoing. Yet. But the project is under review. And so is your firm." It wasn't a confrontation. It was a formality. Like an executioner explaining the steps before the axe. Outside the building, reporters waited by the steps. Not many. Not yet. But enough to make Denise walk faster and Carter avoid eye contact with anyone holding a camera. They hadn't expected this. They thought they were playing a press game. Thought my blueprints were just eccentric notes from a has-been. Thought Brian could charm his way through red tape. But they forgot the golden rule of architecture. Everything you build has weight. Even lies. The first official inquiry landed in the firm's inbox 3 days later. A request for documentation on all subcontractors tied to the Clearview redevelopment. A formality on the surface. But the language was pointed. Verification of vendor legitimacy, it read. Detailed invoicing. Source of funds. Certification of cost transparency. Brian called Harper into his office that morning. He closed the door, but not before the junior staff saw his hands trembling. Harper sat across from him, stiff-backed. She looked tired. Or maybe just smarter than she had a week ago. "I need your help," he said. "This whole thing is a misunderstanding. Edward, he's bitter. He's trying to sabotage the firm." Harper didn't reply right away. "You told me you designed it," she said. "I did. Mostly." She gave him a look. Brian sighed. "Okay, no. Ed left behind the drafts, and we expanded them. But it was collaborative. It counts." "Then why are you sweating through your shirt?" she asked flatly. He leaned in, desperate now. "We just need to clean this up. Get ahead of it. Can you pull the original file backups? I want to cross-reference the annotations." Harper's mouth tightened. "I already did," she said. "The embedded codes weren't added later. They're part of the original scan timestamps. They've been there for weeks, maybe months." Brian blinked. "And I found the embedded QR strings." She slid a printed screenshot across the desk. It showed a zoomed-in section of the south-facing elevation, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The QR code was microscopic, buried in the linework. When scanned, she said, it opens a PDF with tax records. Shell company registrations. Offshore transfers. All under names tied to past Lang & Partners projects. Brian's voice dropped to a whisper. Why would he do this? Harper's eyes narrowed. Because you took credit for his legacy and thought he'd just fade into dust. Brian stood abruptly, knocking his chair against the wall. This stays between us. Harper didn't reply. That silence. It wasn't agreement. It was judgment. Back in my apartment, I watched the pieces shift from afar. I had friends still inside city planning, older ones, the kind who owed me quiet favors and liked long lunches. They told me Mariel had sent 2 additional inquiries to the firm. One was financial. The other? Ethics board. That's when it became real. Denise showed up at my door the next day. She didn't call first. I opened the door slowly. She was dressed sharp, as always, but the lines around her mouth were deeper. Her lipstick looked freshly applied, like she'd done it in the car. "Edward," she said. "Denise," I replied. She didn't ask to come in. Just stood there, as if the hallway was safer. "I assume you know what's happening." "I read the paper," I said. "I didn't expect this from you." That made me smile. "You expected me to take the severance and fade away. Not embed a digital minefield in the plans." Her jaw tensed. "You're burning the whole house down." "No," I said, stepping closer. "I'm just pulling back the drywall and showing everyone the mold." She didn't respond. "Why'd you do it, Denise? You had everything. We built something real." She hesitated. "You stopped evolving," she said. "You became sentimental. Thought architecture was about soul. The rest of us had to survive. And Brian? He's young. He doesn't ask questions." I nodded slowly. "Then you should have thought twice before making him the face of a fraud." Her silence said more than any defense could. "I'd like you to stop," she said finally. "I already have," I said. "The blueprints are out. The rest is momentum." She looked past me, as if hoping the years of friendship could still pull a lever. "I wish it hadn't come to this." "So do I," I said, and gently closed the door in her face. That night, I stood at the window again. The skyline hadn't changed. But the ground beneath it had started to shift. The press didn't know the full story yet. Neither did the city. But suspicion had taken root. Investigators were circling. Reporters had started calling the firm for statements. And the Clearview redevelopment project, their grand, glittering prize, was now radioactive. I had drawn a trap. They stepped into it willingly. And now, the structure they'd built on lies was beginning to creak. The knock came late. Almost midnight. Not a frantic one. Just 3 slow, solid raps on the door. Like someone trying to look calm while holding back a hurricane. I knew it was Raymond before I even looked through the peephole. He stood there with his coat still on, collar half raised, as if he'd forgotten he was wearing it. His eyes were sunken, his jaw clenched. I opened the door but didn't say a word. Just let the silence do the work. "Edward," he said, and the name came out brittle. "Raymond," I replied, just as flat. "I won't stay long. I just need to talk." I stepped aside and let him in. He moved like a man walking into a church, cautious and reverent, but not entirely sure he still believed. He didn't sit. Just stood in the middle of the room, looking around like he hadn't seen it in years. And he hadn't. None of them had ever been here. They were always too busy or too important to cross the bridge to my side of the city. Now he looked like he might never leave. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said finally. "You did what we all thought was impossible." "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending I didn't know what you were." He winced slightly. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "It never is." Raymond took off his coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and finally sat down. He rubbed his temples with his fingers like he was trying to press the guilt back into place. The council froze the Clearview project, he said. Pending investigation. Brian's a mess. Denise is talking about legal teams. I poured 2 glasses of water. Not out of hospitality. Just routine. Old habits that linger like wallpaper. He didn't touch his. We didn't know, he muttered. Bullshit. He looked up, startled by the sharpness in my voice. I leaned forward. You knew what Carter was doing with the inspectors. You signed off on those consulting fees that went nowhere. You looked the other way every time Denise patted an invoice. I didn't. You did, I snapped. You just didn't care. Because we were making money. Because the buildings were going up and the checks were clearing. He didn't argue. Just stared at his glass like it might hold a better defense than he could summon. You were the one who told me once that an architect's real power isn't in design, it's in omission, I said. You said that not drawing something was just as deliberate as drawing it. Raymond nodded slowly. I remember. Well, I said, this time I didn't omit a damn thing. He took a deep breath, held it for a moment, and let it out with a shudder. They're going to come after us. I know. I'm not built for scandal, Ed. You know that. No one is. He stared at me for a long time. Why now? Why not just walk away? I thought about it. About that moment in the conference room when they gave Brian my chair, handed me a plaque and a smile and tried to erase me like whiteout on a blueprint. Because walking away would have let you pretend you were still the good guys, I said. This way, you don't get to. He stood suddenly, too quickly, like the chair had burned him. I wanted to tell you, he said. You were always the best of us. The heart of the firm. I laughed. It wasn't kind. You should have remembered that before you gutted it. Raymond didn't answer. He just nodded once, a tired, defeated motion, and picked up his coat. At the door, he hesitated. You've destroyed us. No, I said. You destroyed yourselves. I just gave the city a flashlight. He left without another word. The next morning, Denise sent out an internal memo. All staff were to cease communication with the press. Legal counsel was being retained. A thorough internal audit was underway to demonstrate good faith and full cooperation. I read it twice and almost smiled. Harper sent me a message. Just one line. You were right. I see it now. I didn't reply. The paper ran a front-page story that afternoon. Lang and Partners under investigation for financial irregularities. My name wasn't mentioned. But my blueprint was. The article called it a design of unusual complexity, containing coded financial indicators that city planners are now treating as evidence. Evidence. That word echoed in the back of my mind as I walked through the neighborhood that evening. Past the construction sites, the stalled towers, the scaffolding that clung like bandages to the half-built promises of men who never intended to finish anything cleanly. I passed by the pavilion, the one with my name on the cornerstone. A janitor mopped the front lobby. I paused outside the glass, watching the water swirl across the tile. He looked up. Our eyes met. He nodded. I nodded back. We were both just men cleaning up someone else's mess. 2 days later, Carter showed up at my building. I didn't answer the buzzer. He waited outside for 20 minutes before leaving. His desperation tasted different than Raymond's. Less remorse, more fear. That made sense. Carter had more to lose. His name was on too many contracts, too many backroom deals. I watched from the window as he walked away. The cracks were spreading. By Friday, 2 junior architects had quit. By Sunday, 3 city inspectors were subpoenaed. And by Monday, Brian was nowhere to be found. I got word through a former colleague that he'd taken medical leave. The truth? He was hiding. Waiting to see which way the wind blew. He wouldn't be the last. Because once the structure starts to buckle, it never collapses all at once. It starts with a groan. Then a snap. Then the slow, inevitable fall. And I had drawn every line of it. They raided the office at 9:12 a.m. on a Wednesday. Lang and Partners, once the pride of the district, the gleaming machine that built half the skyline, now had half a dozen federal agents in windbreakers escorting employees out while photographers snapped through the glass. The words SEC and City Fraud Task Force were printed in sharp white on their backs. It was a beautiful day. Clear skies. Crisp air. The kind of day we used to describe in our renderings as sun-drenched urban mornings. The irony wasn't lost on me. I watched it all from my apartment, news streaming live on my monitor, muted so I could hear the street noise. Real noise. Not the polished spin of press releases. There were no words this time. Just images. Brian's nameplate being removed from the door. Denise sitting on a bench outside, head in her hands. Carter in handcuffs. Yes, handcuffs. That part hit like a cold glass of water to the face. They weren't just investigating anymore. They were charging. The indictments dropped 2 hours later. 37 counts in total. Wire fraud. Tax evasion. Racketeering. Misuse of public funds. Forgery. The language was surgical. Clean. Like slicing open a carcass and naming each organ. Each count corresponded to a transaction or document, almost all of them pulled straight from the embedded data I'd buried in the blueprints. It wasn't just Clearview that implicated them. Once the investigators knew what to look for, they began cross-referencing every major project the firm had touched in the last 10 years. And those projects? They weren't clean. Not even close. One after another, the dominoes fell. The 2016 transit overhaul, overbilled by 22%, with ghost contractors listed in procurement forms. The West Bank Tower, built with substandard concrete, thanks to a sweetheart deal Carter negotiated with a supplier who didn't exist on paper. Even the waterfront greenway, my personal heartbreak, had been rigged. They'd funneled cleanup funds through a restoration firm that turned out to be a P.O. box in Nevada. And now it was all public. The papers didn't pull punches this time. Headlines read: Lang and Partners implodes under weight of massive corruption scandal. Blueprints expose decade of fraud, how one design toppled an empire. They didn't print my name. But they didn't have to. People knew. I didn't leave the apartment that day. I didn't need to. The phone rang off the hook, reporters, former colleagues, even old clients who'd suddenly remembered my number. I let them all go to voicemail. Let the story shape itself without my hand on the tiller. Let them wonder. Let them fill in the gaps. I walked to my drafting table instead, sat in the same chair I'd used for 30 years, and laid out a clean sheet of vellum. For a moment, I just stared at it. So much of my life had lived in that space, the quiet scratch of graphite, the slow breathing of rulers and arcs, the dance of math and intuition. It had always been my sanctuary. But now? Now it felt like a grave marker. I started drawing anyway. Not a building. Not this time. Just shapes. Curves. Geometry with no purpose but presence. I needed to move the pencil again. I needed to feel the lines return to me not as weapons, but as language. In the corner of the sheet, without thinking, I wrote. Collapse is also a form of architecture. And I meant it. By evening, the firm's website was down. Their social accounts deactivated. The physical sign outside their building was gone by morning, torn down overnight like a tyrant statue after the coup. Brian hadn't been arrested. Yet. But he was the talk of the town. The golden boy caught holding the blueprint when the lights came on. He gave a statement to the press, voice cracking, "I didn't know. I trusted the partners. I was misled." And maybe that was true. But he still took the chair. Still took the credit. Still smirked when they pushed me out like an old relic. I didn't pity him. Arrogance is a kind of debt. Eventually, the interest compounds. Harper came by later that week. No call. Just a knock, soft and unassuming. She stood in the hallway with a brown paper bag and tired eyes. I opened the door without a word, and she held up the bag. "Figured you hadn't eaten." We sat in silence, eating takeout from a Thai place down the block. The city hummed outside, indifferent as always. "You did it," she said finally. "You really did it." "No," I replied. "They did it. I just gave them the mirror." She nodded slowly, pushing noodles around in the box. "I stayed as long as I could. But today, I resigned." Smart. There's nothing left. The firm's blacklisted. Nobody wants to touch anything they built. "Good," I said. "Maybe the city will breathe for once." She looked at me, like she wanted to ask something more, but didn't. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of the original blueprint, the real one. The one I'd drawn with everything inside it. She placed it on the table between us. "People should see this," she said. "They will," I replied. "Eventually." We finished our food. She left the blueprint. I watched her walk down the hall and disappear into the elevator. For the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. Not happy. Not triumphant. Just unburdened. The next morning, I walked to the corner cafe. No disguise. No hat pulled low. A man in line recognized me. Stared too long. Finally, he said, "You're the guy, aren't you?" "I'm a lot of things," I said. He smiled. "Thanks for cleaning house." I nodded. That was all I needed. Not a headline. Not a statue. Just that. Because while the city slept under towers built on lies, I'd spent my nights designing a truth too sharp to ignore. I didn't need applause. I didn't need credit. I had something better. Justice, rendered in graphite and code. The irony of it was poetic. Brian had always believed he was invincible. He was tall, handsome in that magazine spread way, and walked like the city belonged to him. Even back when he was just my intern, he had a way of moving through rooms like they were already applauding. But confidence without understanding is like a glass skyscraper without rebar. Looks impressive, until the first storm. And the storm had arrived. It started with the subpoenas. He wasn't just a peripheral name anymore, he was the name. He'd stood on that stage, claimed the project, put his name on the presentation, and told the world this was his vision. The ink on his statement was barely dry when the SEC began combing through every transaction that bore his signature. Turns out Brian was good at networking, decent at design, but terrible at cover-ups. He didn't know the difference between a routing code and a structural grid. He didn't see the subtle placement of false invoice markers or know that layering file metadata into a CAD document could be used to track upload histories. I did. He didn't. And now it was unraveling all around him. Publicly. Painfully. Perfectly. The first televised interview aired on a Thursday evening. Brian sat stiff in a studio chair, the kind with too bright lighting that makes even the confident sweat. His eyes darted, and his usual ease was gone, replaced by a rigid, almost rehearsed panic. The host didn't waste time. "You were the lead architect on the Clearview project, correct?" I was overseeing the team," Brian said. "The concept was collaborative. But you presented it as your own. Your name was on the materials. Brian shifted. We integrated elements left behind by a former partner. Edward Lang. Yes, he said too quickly. So you admit the project wasn't entirely yours? Well, yes, but that's common in firms. Concepts evolve. Attribution is often shared. Yet his name never appeared on any documentation. Brian's mouth opened, but no words came out. The host didn't let up. Investigators say the blueprint you submitted was embedded with financial data tied to fraudulent transactions. How do you respond? I wasn't aware. You put your name on a blueprint you didn't understand. That line hit hard. Hard enough that the clip went viral. They replayed it across every local news station and architecture blog in the city. Brian, stuttering in a suit too tight with guilt, caught under lights brighter than his future. I got a call that evening from one of my oldest friends in the field, retired now. She didn't say much. Just laughed and said, "You've got a mean streak, Ed. Never thought you had it in you." Neither did I. But here we were. The next week, the disciplinary board of the American Institute of Architects suspended Brian's license pending a full ethics review. The board cited gross professional negligence, failure to disclose attribution, and potential complicity in financial misconduct. Brian released a written statement. I was unaware of the true nature of the documents. I trusted my team. I regret the oversight. It was carefully worded. Sterile. Empty. And no one believed a word of it. Especially not the interns now being subpoenaed, nor the assistants who were quietly lawyering up. See, Brian had created a culture of arrogance. He mocked the old guard, dismissed the meticulous, and surrounded himself with people who told him he was brilliant. When the foundation cracked, none of them held it up. They all stepped back. Because arrogance is loud, until accountability walks into the room. Then it's silent. I ran into him, unexpectedly, at a cafe downtown. It had been raining. He looked smaller. Thinner. Not like a man who'd been humbled, like a man who'd been hollowed out. He saw me. Froze mid-sip. The barista was handing him a bagel. He left it on the counter. Edward, he said. Voice low. No confidence in it now. I nodded. Didn't offer a seat. He looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe a plea. Instead, he just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the tile. I didn't know, he finally said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. He didn't know. Not just about the fraud, but about architecture. About legacy. About what it meant to build something that outlived ego. He was a figurehead. A suit with a sharp jawline and a hollow briefcase. You were supposed to be me, I said. Brian blinked. You were supposed to carry it forward. Take the foundation we built and elevate it. You had every resource, every advantage. And you wasted it trying to be a headline. He looked down. You didn't fall, I said. You jumped. And I walked past him, leaving him there between a latte machine and the ruins of what could have been. That evening, a blog post went up on a respected architecture site. The Fall of Brian Kellerman, Style Without Substance. It quoted former employees, anonymous tips, industry veterans. It dissected his projects, exposed inconsistencies, and laid bare his mediocrity. One line stuck with me. He was a man who inherited a palace and sold the bricks. I printed it out. Not to gloat. But because some truths deserve permanence. Harper sent me another message that night. They're dissolving the firm officially next month. Assets being seized. Lawsuits flying. It's over. I replied this time. No. It's only just begun. Because the city had started asking questions. Who else knew? Which inspectors looked away? Which council members benefited? The blueprint had started a fire. And fires don't just stop when the house is gone. They find new wood. And while the city burned off its rot, I sat in the dark of my apartment, sketching again. Not buildings. But restoration. Real restoration. The kind that comes after the collapse. The kind that lasts. You wouldn't recognize me now. Not because I've changed. I wear the same worn coat. The same glasses. My gait is slower, sure, but not weak. Just deliberate. No, you wouldn't recognize me because no one sees the architect when the building stands tall. They only remember the ribbon cutting, the politicians, the people in suits with polished shoes and empty hands. And that's fine. Because I didn't do this for recognition. I did it for balance. It's a strange thing, walking through a city you helped shape. Every corner holds a ghost. Not of people, though there are those too, but of intention. Here's the street where I fought to preserve the canopy of trees because I knew sunlight filtering through leaves would slow people down. Make them linger. Connect. Here's the building whose roofline I designed to mirror the rise of the hills behind it. Most people don't notice, but their bodies feel it. That harmony between natural and built space, it whispers peace without saying a word. And here, right here, is where Lang and Partners was supposed to build their legacy. Now it's just an empty lot, roped off with caution tape and weeds already claiming the soil. A billboard still stands, faded and weather-worn, advertising a future that was never going to exist. Coming soon, the Clearview District. Where vision meets tomorrow. Below it, someone spray-painted in red. Tomorrow was built on lies. I stood there for a long time the first time I saw that. Not out of satisfaction, but gravity. Because this was never about revenge. Not entirely. It was about truth. And truth, when buried deep enough, becomes structural. You can build on it, or you can ignore it. But if you do the latter, eventually, it will bring everything down. The investigations went on longer than I expected. More than just the firm fell. Several inspectors were fired. A few charged. One councilman resigned before the subpoenas reached his desk. Whispers of new oversight committees started cropping up. Citizen watchdogs. Zoning reviews with teeth. Change, slow and clumsy, like everything in a city. But real. And it started with a pencil and a piece of vellum. I never told anyone the full extent of what I did. Not the press. Not Harper. Not even the city planner who sent me a bottle of scotch with a note that simply said, "Thank you for caring." I poured a glass, toasted the skyline, and put the bottle away. I didn't need more. Because the real victory wasn't public. It was in the silence. The lack of applause. The absence of ceremony. You see, architecture teaches you that the most important parts of a structure are the ones people never see, the rebar beneath the concrete, the weight-load calculations behind every arch, the drainage lines no one notices until they fail. That's where the integrity lives. That's where I live now. Not on stages. But in the foundations. Harper opened her own firm. She didn't use my name. Didn't ride the scandal. She called it, Line and Light. I sent her a single envelope the day it launched. Inside was a copy of the first design I ever drew. A schoolhouse. Humble. Balanced. Functional. On the back, I wrote. Keep the soul. Even when the money gets loud. She sent nothing back. But months later, I saw her name in a small article, Emerging Firm Wins Bid for Affordable Housing Project. And in the renderings, the windows were set just like I taught her. To pull in morning light. To warm the spaces where people forget they deserve beauty. She learned. That was enough. As for me, I walk. That's all. No consulting. No lectures. No memoirs. Just a man moving through the city like a stone in a river. Still. Unmoved. Quietly shaping the current. People think justice looks like a courtroom. A headline. A verdict. But sometimes justice is architectural. Invisible. Permanent. The firm is gone. Their buildings stand, some of them, anyway, but they carry different meanings now. Case studies in failure. Testaments to ego. And me? I'm just a name people whisper when they talk about the fall. A ghost with a ruler. A rumor with sharp edges. One morning, I passed a group of students sketching outside the old pavilion, the first building I ever completed. Their instructor, a gray-bearded man with a frayed notebook, pointed toward the cornices and said, "Notice the detail here. That's Lang's work. Subtle. Measured. Elegant." One student raised a hand. "Isn't he the guy who?" The teacher cut her off. "He was an architect," he said. "A real one. Not perfect. But precise. He understood something we forget these days." The girl lowered her hand, and they kept drawing. I didn't stop. Didn't speak. Just walked on, my legacy held not in praise, but in precision. And that was the greatest revenge of all. They tried to erase me. But I rebuilt myself in the bones of their downfall. And now, every time they pass a building that still stands. Every time the wind rustles through a line of trees left untouched. Every time a shadow falls just right across a sidewalk. They remember. Even if they don't know why. I am there. Still drawing. In silence. But always exact.